Chapter 17, Starkey was standing in front of Monitor 2, keeping a close eye on Tech Second Class Frank D. Bruce. When we last saw Bruce, he was face down in a bowl of chunky sirloin soup. No change except for the positive ID. Situation normal, all fucked up. Thoughtfully, hands locked behind his back like a general reviewing troops, like General Black Jack Pershing, his boyhood idol, Starkey moved down to Monitor 4, where the situation had changed for the better. Dr. Emmanuel Eswick still lay dead on the floor, but the centrifuge had stopped. At 1940 hours last night, the centrifuge had begun to emit fine tendrils of smoke. At 1995 hours the sound pickups in Eswick's lab had transmitted a wonga 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 sort of sound that deepened into a fuller, richer, and more satisfying ronk. 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 At 2107 hours the centrifuge had ronked its last ronk and had slowly come to rest. Was it Newton who had said that somewhere, beyond the farthest star, there may be a body perfectly at rest? Newton had been right about everything but the distance, Starkey thought. You didn't have to go far at all. Project Blue was perfectly at rest. Starkey was very glad. The centrifuge had been the last illusion of life, and the problem he'd had Steffens run through the main computer bank. Steffens had looked at him as though he were crazy, and yes, Starkey thought he might be, was, how long could that centrifuge be expected to run? The answer, which had come back in 6 seconds, was, plus or minus 3 years probable malfunction next 2 weeks. 0.009% areas of probable malfunction bearings 38% main motor 16% all other 54%. That was a smart computer. Starkey had gotten Steffens to query it again after the actual burnout of Eswick's centrifuge. The computer communed with the engineering systems data bank and confirmed that the centrifuge had indeed burned out its bearings. Remember that, Starkey thought as his collar began to beep urgently behind him. The sound of burning bearings in the final stages of collapse is ronk ronk ronk. He went to the collar and pushed the button that snapped off the beeper. Yes, Len. Billy, I've got an urgent from one of our teams in a town called Sipe Springs, Texas. Almost 400 miles from Arnett. They say they have to talk to you, it's a command decision. What is it, Len? He asked calmly. He had taken over 16 downers in the last 10 hours, and was, generally speaking, feeling fine. Not a sign of a ronk. Press. Oh Jesus, Starkey said mildly. Patch them through. There was a muffled roar of static with a voice talking unintelligibly behind it. Wait a minute, Len said. The static slowly cleared. Lion, Team Lion, do you read, Blue Base? Can you read? 1, 2, 3, 4, this is Team Lion, I've got you, Team Lion, Starkey said. This is Blue Base 1. Problem is coded flower pot in the contingency book, the tinny voice said. Repeat, flower pot. I know what the fuck flower pot is, Starkey said. What's the situation? The tinny voice coming from Sipe Springs talked uninterrupted for almost 5 minutes. The situation itself was unimportant, Starkey thought, because the computer had informed him 2 days ago that just this sort of situation, in some shape or form, was apt to occur before the end of June. 88% probability. The specifics didn't matter. If it had 2 legs and belt loops, it was a pair of pants. Never mind the color. A doctor in Sipe Springs had made some good guesses, and a pair of reporters for a Houston daily had linked what was happening in Sipe Springs with what had already happened in Arnett, Verona, Commerce City, and a town called Pulliston, Kansas. Those were the towns where the problem had gotten so bad so fast that the army had been sent into quarantine. The computer had a list of 25 other towns in 10 states where traces of blue were beginning to show up. The Sipe Springs situation wasn't important because it wasn't unique. They'd had their chance at unique in Arnett Ewell, maybe Ann flubbed it. What was important was that the situation was finally going to see print on something besides yellow military flimsy. Was, anyway, unless Starkey took steps. He hadn't decided whether to do that or not. But when the tinny voice stopped talking, Starkey realized that he had made the decision after all. He had perhaps made it as long as 20 years ago. It came down to what was important. And what was important wasn't the fact of the disease, it wasn't the fact that Atlanta's integrity had somehow been breached and they were going to have to switch the whole preventative operation to much less satisfactory facilities in Stovington, Vermont. It wasn't the fact that blue spread in such sneaky, common cold disguise. What is important, say again, Blue Base 1, the voice said anxiously. We did not copy. What was important was that a regrettable incident had occurred. Starkey flashed back in time 22 years to 1968. He had been in the Officers Club in San Diego when the news came about Cali and what had happened at My Lai 4. Starkey had been playing poker with 4 other men, 2 of whom now sat on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The poker game had been forgotten, utterly forgotten, in a discussion of exactly what this was going to do to the military, not any one branch but the entire military in the witch hunt atmosphere of Washington's Fourth Estate. And one of their number, a man who could now dial directly to the miserable worm who had been masquerading as a chief executive since January 20, 1959, had laid his cards carefully down on the green felt table and he had said, "Gentlemen, a regrettable incident has occurred." And when a regrettable incident occurs which involves any branch of the United States military, we don't question the roots of that incident but rather how the branches may best be pruned. The service is mother and father to us. And if you find your mother raped or your father beaten and robbed, before you call the police or begin an investigation, you cover their nakedness. Because you love them. Starkey had never heard anyone talk so well before or since. Now he unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and fumbled out a thin blue folder bound with red tape. The legend written on the cover read, "If tape is broken, notify all security divisions at once." Starkey broke the tape. "Are you there, Blue Base 1?" The voice was asking. "We do not copy you." "Repeat, do not copy." "I'm here, Lion," Starkey said. He had flipped to the last page of the book and now ran his finger down a column labeled Extreme Covert Countermeasures. "Lion, do you read?" "We read 5 by, Blue Base 1. Troy," Starkey said deliberately. "I repeat, Lion, Troy. Repeat back, please. Over to you." Silence. A faraway mumble of static. Starkey was fleetingly reminded of the walkie-talkies they made as kids, 2 tin Del Monte cans and 20 yards of wax string. "I say again, oh Jesus." A very young voice in Sipe Springs gulped. "Repeat back, son," Starkey said. "T. Troy," the voice said. Then, more strongly, "Troy." "Very good," Starkey said calmly. "God bless you, son. Over and out." "And you, sir." "Over and out." A click, followed by heavy static, followed by another click, silence, and Len Creighton's voice. "Billy?" "Yes, Len. I copied the whole thing." "That's fine, Len," Starkey said tiredly. "You make your report as you see fit." "Of course." "You don't understand, Billy," Len said. "You did the right thing. Don't you think I know that?" Starkey let his eyes slip closed. For a moment all the sweet downers deserted him. "God bless you, too, Len," he said, and his voice was close to breaking. He switched off and went back to stand in front of monitor 2. He put his hands behind his back like a black Jack Pershing reviewing troops. He regarded Frank D. Bruce and his final resting place. In a little while he felt calm again. Going southeast out of Sipe Springs, if you get on US 36, you are headed in the general direction of Houston, a day's drive away. The car burning up the road was a 3-year-old Pontiac Bonneville, doing 80, and when it came over the rise and saw the nondescript Ford blocking the road, there was nearly an accident. The driver, a 36-year-old stringer for a large Houston daily, tromped on the power brake and the tires began to screech, the Pontiac's nose first dipping down toward the road and then beginning to brake to the left, holy God. The photographer in the shotgun seat cried. He dropped his camera to the floor and began to scramble his seatbelt across his middle. The driver let up on the brake, skirted the Ford on the shoulder, and then felt his left wheels start to drag in the soft dirt. He matted the gas pedal and the Bonneville responded with more traction, dragging back onto the blacktop. Blue smoke squirted from beneath the tires. The radio blared on and on, "Baby, can you dig your man, he's a righteous man, baby, can you dig your man?" He tromped the brake again, and the Bonneville slewed to a stop in the middle of the hot and deserted afternoon. He drew in a ragged, terrified breath and then coughed it out in a series of bursts. He began to be angry. He threw the Pontiac into reverse and backed toward the Ford and the two men standing behind it. "Listen," the photographer said nervously. He was fat and hadn't been in a fight since the 9th grade. "Listen, maybe we just better." He was thrown forward with a grunt as the stringer brought the Pontiac to another screeching halt, threw the transmission lever into park with one hard thrust of his hand, and got out. He began to walk toward the two young men behind the Ford, his hands doubled into fists. "All right, motherfuckers," he shouted. "You almost got us fucking killed and I want," he had been in the service, 4 years in the army. Volunteer. He had just time to identify the rifles as the new M3As when they brought them up from below the rear deck of the Ford. He stood shocked in the hot Texas sunshine and made water in his pants. He began to scream and in his mind he was turning to run back to the Bonneville but his feet never moved. They opened up on him, and slugs blew out his chest and groin. As he dropped to his knees, holding both hands out mutely for mercy, a slug struck him an inch over his left eye and tore off the top of his head. The photographer, who had been twisted over the back seat, found it impossible to comprehend exactly what had happened until the two young men stepped over the stringer's body and began to walk toward him, rifles raised. He slid across the Pontiac seat, warm bubbles of saliva collecting at the corners of his mouth. The keys were still in the ignition. He turned the car on and screamed out just as they began shooting. He felt the car lurch to the right as if a giant had kicked the left rear, and the wheel began to shimmy wildly in his hands. The photographer bounced up and down as the Bonneville pogoed up the road on the flat tire. A second later the giant kicked the other side of the car. The shimmy got worse. Sparks flew off the blacktop. The photographer was whining. The Pontiac's rear tires shimmied and flapped like black rags. The two young men ran back to their Ford, whose serial number was listed among the multitude in the Army Vehicles Division at the Pentagon, and one of them drove it around in a tight, swaying circle. The nose bounced wildly as it came off the shoulder and drove over the body of the stringer. The sergeant in the passenger seat sprayed a startled sneeze onto the windshield. Ahead of them, the Pontiac washing machine along on its two flat rear tires, the nose bouncing up and down. Behind the wheel the fat photographer had begun to weep at the sight of the dark Ford growing in the rear-view mirror. He had the accelerator pressed to the floor but the Pontiac would do no more than 40 and it was all over the road. On the radio Larry Underwood had been replaced by Madonna. Madonna was asserting that she was a material girl. The Ford swung around the Bonneville and for 1 second of crystal hope the photographer thought it was going to keep right on going, to just disappear over the desolate horizon and let him alone. Then it pulled back in, and the Pontiac's wildly jittering nose caught its mudguard. There was a scream of pulling metal. The photographer's head flew forward into the wheel and blood sprayed from his nose. Throwing terrified, creaky-necked glances back over his shoulder, he slid across the warm plastic seat as if it were grease and got out on the passenger side. He ran down the shoulder. There was a barbed wire fence and he leaped over it, sailing up and up like a blimp, and he thought, "I'm going to make it. I can run forever." He fell down on the other side with his leg caught in the barbs. Screaming at the sky, he was still trying to free his pants and dimpled white flesh when the two young men came down the shoulder with their guns in their hands. Why, he tried to ask them, but all that came out of him was a low and helpless squawk and then his brains exited the back of his head. There was no published report of disease or any other trouble in Sipe Springs, Texas, that day.